Hi, good evening, everyone. Jack couldn't be with us tonight, so Amita has asked me to say a few remarks to begin. And so first and foremost, I want to just say thank you for being here. I know that for me, since last Tuesday, simply leaving the safety of my apartment has sometimes been difficult, especially to come to things that make it seem like life is normal again. So thank you for, being here and for joining us in this discussion. In our post-Trump world, it makes you sort of rethink everything. And for me, it's really made me think about the political salience of my work. Beauty and fashion studies, those of us who do beauty and fashion studies have always had to fight against the idea that beauty and fashion and embodiment is simply the frivolous stuff of the everyday. But our post-Trump world has shown us that non-white bodies are marked more than ever before. This has been especially true for South Asians since 9/11, and Vanita Reddy, Ayqa Khan, and Meera Sethi's work offer us critical tools with which to think about this, but also just as importantly, refuge from this painful reality in helping us to think about the connections between politics and pleasure, and adornment and style politics. Over the weekend, I went to the Smithsonian APA Institute's Culture Lab on Imagined Futures, and I honestly kind of didn't want to go. For all the reasons that I stated earlier, it was hard to get there. But when I got there, I was so glad that I was there. The artists and the scholars assembled there constructed the most beautiful worlds, and more importantly, these alternative political realities that I think all of us so desperately need right now. But I was so struck while I was there, while I was inspired, I was also struck by the idea and the reminder that we've always been doing this work. We've been doing it before Tuesday, and we will continue doing it, although perhaps now with much more urgency. The state, now more than ever before, is not and cannot be the center of political life. And I think all of us feel that as acutely true right now. Art, writing, scholarship, that's me. I'm Sharon Heijin. Art, writing, scholarship, and intellectualism is where we will imagine alternatives to Trump's America. And tonight, Vanita, Meera, and Ayqa's work inspire us to not only see this, but to embody these alternatives. And so I'm so happy to be a part of this event. I'm going to go ahead and introduce each of our participants before they come up and speak. So first we have Vanita Reddy, who is an associate professor of English at Texas A&M University with faculty affiliations in Women's and Gender Studies and the Race and Ethnic Studies Institute. Her research focuses on the study of cultural identity, political community, and practices of national and transnational belonging within the South Asian American and the global South Asian diaspora. She is the author of the awesome book, Fashioning Diaspora, Beauty, Femininity, and South Asian American Culture, one of the first books to consider beauty and fashion as a critical point of entry into examination of South Asian public cultures. She is currently working on her second book, which examines cross-racial affiliations between South Asian and other racialized diasporic populations from a queer feminist perspective. She is co-editing a forthcoming special issue of Scholar and Feminists Online that emerges out of this project called Feminist and Queer Afro-Asian Formations. Please join me in welcoming Vanita.
So thank you to Sharon for the segue from post-Trump to beauty, because I didn't want to do that. So I think the stuff about not looking to the state and looking to aesthetics and art and affect, that will really resonate, I think, in this talk. So, okay, in my book, Fashioning Diaspora, I examine how and under what conditions diasporic practices of beauty and fashion produce racialized embodiments and affects that put pressure on neoliberal practices of the self and the social. These are practices in which an attachment to beauty and fashionability facilitates individual self-management according to principles of discipline, efficiency, and competitiveness in ways that shore up diasporic consumer citizenship. In this talk on diasporic visual cultures, I build upon the book's examination of diasporic beauty and fashion. And in the book, I look at literature, film, digital media, and live performance as forms of aesthetic labor and capital that allow diasporic subjects access to various kinds of social privilege and prestige, and as forms of labor and care, both the labor of self-beautification and the labor of beautifying an other or others as collective acts of care and even social responsibility. Through a common interest in practices of beauty and sartorial forms, visual cultures can animate the material histories, affective circuits, and embodied practices of diasporic belonging. Here, I focus on the soft masculinities of Sikh fashionability, the feminine failures of young women's marital unsuitability, and the generational swag of aunties. As I discuss in the book, I'm interested in how these affects and embodiments exceed the racialized and gendered orientalisms of the dominant fashion system, for example, in global fashion trends such as Indo-chic, which has faded in and out of popularity since the 1990s, and how they challenge heterocapitalist normativities of diasporic belonging. In August 2012, a Sikh blogger with the screen name Brooklynwala posted a blog on the Sikh American online community forum Langar Hall titled "Turbans on the Runway, What Does It Mean for Sikhs?" In it, he eloquently responds to French fashion designer Jean-Paul Gaultier's debut of Turban Chic, in which Gaultier did not use Sikh models, for his spring 2012 menswear line at Paris Fashion Week just a few months earlier. Brooklynwala calls specific attention to the massacre of Sikh worshippers at a Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, which left 6 people dead and occurred just 1 month after Gaultier debuted Turban Chic on the runway. Referencing Gaultier's show, Brooklynwala muses, "Now that turbans are all the rage in the fashion world, will people think I'm cooler in my turban when it also comes with a long beard and brown skin?" While critiques such as Brooklynwala's of the turban's cultural appropriation in the wake of the most recent spate of anti-Sikh violence, and I say recent because there are actual historical flashpoints that precede this, including the Yellow Peril in the United States, partition in India, and the British banning of the turban in the 1960s. So while these critiques of cultural appropriation are certainly understandable, they can't actually account fully for the turban's renewed fashionability among Sikh fashion industrialists. In the months following Gaultier's debut of turbans and the Oak Creek massacre, Indian, British, and US Sikh fashion industrialists began to showcase the turban in their aesthetic creations, cultivating a diasporic aesthetic of Sikh chic that is distinct from the Orientalist aesthetics of turban chic, or I want to claim that they're distinct. While for Gaultier, turban chic frames the fashionable cosmopolitan male subject as necessarily at a cultural remove from Sikh bodies and identities, and from the Sikh turban as an everyday sartorial practice, Sikh chic visualizes the clothing practices, poses, and comportments of the everyday turbaned Sikh body as fashionable. In 2012, Pradeep Singh Bara launched his London-based street-style fashion blog, Sing Street Style. And many of you actually might be familiar with it, it's pretty popular. And he has since risen to fashion prominence as the Sikh sartorialist. In aestheticizing the Sikh male body, Bara's outfit posts show the turban male subject reclaiming the public space of London streets, a space in which Sikh bodies have been treated with fear, suspicion, and surveillance because of their misassociations with non-national terrorist masculinities, especially after the July 2005 London bombings. Turban Sikh men are photographed in iconically British spaces, flats, government buildings, museums, gardens, and near London's signature red public telephone booths. The predominant pose, Sikh men leaning against public structures and standing with one leg crossed over the other, displays an ease and familiarity with London streets that marks them as ordinary British citizen subjects. Also occasionally interspersed among the outfit posts are black and white photographs of Sikhs walking, shopping, and gathering on London streets in the 1940s and 1950s, with captions such as, "Sikhs have always been fashionable." The inclusion of these historical photographs as part of the blog's media content establishes a tradition of Sikh fashionability during earlier periods of British anti-Sikh sentiment that is continuous with the historical present. Other media content, such as Bara's debut video on the site, "Don't Freak, I'm a Sikh," a turban tying lesson, and photographic self-portraits and selfies that raise awareness about anti-turban sentiment, educate Sikhs and non-Sikhs about the turban essential to Sikh self-representation as rights-bearing citizen subjects. The media content of Sing Street style participates in what I call social vanity, the process by which the advancement of group social, political, and visibility is embedded within the generic conventions of the fashion blog in ways that exceed its largely self-promotional content. Fashion studies scholar Min Hati Pham describes the taste work of personal style blogs as cleaving individual identity from group identity and re-articulating it as individual taste. By contrast, social vanity cultivates individual taste to, at least in part, promote the visibility of group identity. The social vanity of bringing pride and dignity to Sikh male bodies and subjects most often involves embodying soft European metrosexuality. Fitted shirts and fitted pants or skinny jeans, you can see that here, emphasize the smallness, leanness, and litheness of the Sikh male body. And they are at odds with historical representations of Sikhs as threateningly hypermasculine, such as in their associations with aggression, war, militarism, and separatist violence in post-colonial India and in the diaspora. But captions such as "a well-tailored suit is to a woman as lingerie is to a man" also frames Sikh chic within a resolutely heteronormative visual economy that is aimed at ensuring that Sikh women will find Sikh men more sexually attractive. As Bara says of his outfit posts, quote, "Hopefully we've encouraged our Sikh women to embrace turban Sikh men. We've shown that Sikh men can be just as desirable in a classy manner through our style, personality, and our character." Sikh chic allows the turban Sikh male body to appear within the bounds of proper and respectable heterosexual citizenship, and thus dispels the specter of perverse queerness that often hangs over the non-metrosexual turban male body because of the turban's incommensurability with secular modernities. In addition to inviting a desiring female gaze, the posts imagine Sikh women as central to the successful production of Sikh metrosexuality by appealing to them to shop for, dress, and style their men. Though the posts hail diasporic women as consumers and not just producers of fashion, such as in their historical role in the global assembly line of garment work, and Parminder Bachu has a great book about exactly the role of South Asian women in producing fashion, they are at the same time not visible within the blog's visual economy of Sikh chic, except as accessories or supplements to the male bodies that occupy the public space of the street, as when they appear with men modeling Sing Street style signature logos, if they appear at all. So there are a couple of outfit posts where women appear, but they're sort of there to prop up the Sikh man who's featuring the t-shirt. They thus remain largely beyond the frames of vision through which the fashion blogger controls technologies of racial and gendered representation. And I just want to briefly say something about to contrast this to the British Sikh body positivity campaigner Harnam Kaur, who donned the turban and beard for jewelry designer Mariana Hurutunian's show at London Fashion Week in March earlier this year. And I think if you're interested, you should sort of everywhere on social media. Kaur's appearance in the show decenters Sikh heteromasculinity in discourses of Sikh chic, and I think also in really interesting ways probably overlaps with Ayqa's work on body hair. Here I turn to feminist diasporic visual artists Swathi Khurana, Anjali Bhargava, and Meera Sethi. These artists deploy parody, a form of derisive humor in aestheticizing racialized femininity to challenge the gendered and sexualized norms of diasporic belonging. In their collaborative photography collection, Unsuitable Girls, Swathi Khurana and Anjali Bhargava capture a pose, action, or behavior in which the photograph subject appears uninvested in fulfilling the obligations of hetero domestic life. These include, among others, lounging across a bed strewn with academic books and magazines, sitting on a bedroom floor surrounded by garbage bags full of clothes, a look of uncertainty while shopping for marriage necklaces, and drinking wine in a bed while working on a laptop with a toddler daughter napping nearby. The captions, least available daughter, least suitable girl, most apprehensive fiancé, most disheveled, most reluctant housekeeper, least dutiful wife, least orthodox goddess, and most defiant mother are also engravings on the trophies that appear inconspicuously in each photograph, and I put a yellow circle around the one in most defiant mother. They're really hard to see unless you can see the photograph more closely. In creating value around each young woman's failed performance of married domestic femininity, the trophies challenge what Khurana calls heterosexist and class-centered value systems of diasporic communities. Marriage, in particular Desi women's marriages to economically successful Desi men, help to ensure immigrant upward mobility through participation in a capitalist system. The trophies resemble those awarded to beauty pageant winners, and it's hard to see this, but each of them has gowns, crowns, and sashes that appear across each female figure's torso. And as such, they call attention to the beauty-based competition of the Indian American marriage market. Khurana's unpublished semi-autobiographical short story, Ugly Granddaughter, most clearly informs the references to beauty pageants, and perhaps even the popularity of ethnic beauty pageants such as Miss India USA in diasporic communities. In the story, Khurana consistently fails to perform the obligations to Indian female beauty that her grandmother insists are critical to her granddaughter's success on the marriage market. These include looking less like a man, removing facial hair, staying out of the sun to ensure as fair a complexion as possible, and doing yoga. Each photograph and corresponding trophy in Unsuitable Girls builds upon the heteronormative logic of beauty in Ugly Granddaughter, capturing a look, gesture, behavior, or action that is its valued opposite on the marriage market: reluctance versus certainty, apprehension versus attention, defiance versus conformity, etc. Khurana and Burgaba's photographs visualize what I discuss in Fashioning Diaspora as the flat affects of feminine failure. Flat affects name not the exuberant and euphoric celebration of heteronormative success in one's gender, but the much more muted and even discomfited affects of falling short or opting out of such aspirations altogether. Feminine delinquency constitutes a celebration of not doing, even an undoing, of idealized diasporic femininity. Practices of feminine failure here operate as a form of feminist agency through their stubborn refusal to conform to capitalist and heteronormative understandings of diasporic success and achievement. Here I shift to the positive expression of feminist embodiment in a figure who has remained largely unexamined in scholarship on South Asia and its diasporas, the South Asian auntie. In her collection of street-style photographs, Upping the Aunty, South Asian Canadian visual artist Meera Sethi flips the script on conventional street-style fashion by featuring the unconventional, quirky, and highly individualized fashion sense, or swag, of aunties on Mumbai and Toronto streets. Aunties with swag challenges a common perception of the auntie as someone whose middle and older age, gender, and generational status mark her deficiency of style. There is perhaps no greater insult to South Asian femininity or subjects who aspire to its normative conventions of beauty than the comment, "You look like an auntie." But Sethi's outfit posts dispel assumptions of the auntie's sartorial combinations, especially hybrid aesthetics such as saris with sneakers or chappals with socks, and I put a square around the chappals with socks, speak to her dullness, lack of success, datedness, and complicity with anti-modern patriarchal sartorial codes. They instead cue us to the auntie's thoughtfulness and inventive practicality around her chosen style and to adapting her style to seasonal realities, and we see this especially in the photographs of the Toronto aunties. Many of the photographs, in fact, emphasize conventionally unfeminine postures and frames that disarticulate fashionability from feminine norms of sexual attractiveness. These include aunties who squat or sit on stoops with legs splayed, stare directly into the camera, stand with legs apart directly facing the camera, and who take up much of the photographic frame. The auntie on the street also complicates the auntie's the auntie's role as a gendered and generationally specific affective laborer, in which she upholds prevailing cultural attitudes and conventions, especially among young women and men in matters of family, dating, and career, or in which she disciplines and punishes those who stray from them, and who in turn earns communal respect for these forms of care. As Sethi puts it, quote, an auntie may or may not be a biological relation. She may be a friend of the family or a stranger, but if she's older than you, old enough to be your mother's friend, then she is accorded the status of auntie. Neither are mothers nor part of our peer group. Aunties may be trusted confidants or gatekeepers of social decorum. In Upping the Aunty, aunties appear as consumers, professionals, and political activists on sidewalks with passersby and motor vehicles in the background, standing in alleyways, shopping for groceries, and in malls, in parking lots, in public gardens and parks, in hotel lobbies, attending gay pride events, standing near street vendors. These public and individual, rather than private and communal roles, are consolidated through the auntie's sartorial self-possession. The auntie's ability to own it exposes the manufactured aesthetic of authenticity that structures conventional street-style blogs. For example, Sing Street Style, which I discussed earlier, maintains strict requirements around tight-fitting clothing, turbans, and beards as imitative and aspirational markers of Sikh authenticity, right? So the idea is that you too can look like this. In contrast, each auntie's outfit is so individual and non-reproducible that it is too authentic for imitation and rehabilitation within the commercial aesthetics of street style. Auntie swag ups the auntie, or raises the stakes, as the series title puns, of the auntie's social value in diasporic communities by imbuing her with respect, not only because of the affective labor she performs to enhance the life chances and well-being of others, but because of the care of self that she performs in her everyday sartorial choices. Sing Street Style's project of social vanity relies upon the reproduction of authentic Sikh heteromasculinity, even as it challenges transnational histories of British and Indian anti-turban sentiment and the late capitalist orientalism of turban chic. In contrast, Korina, Bhargava, and Sethi's use of parody as a feminist diasporic aesthetic allows them to challenge capitalist mobility and heterosexual desirability and the gendered and sexualized norms of diasporic belonging. It is precisely the heterogeneity of diasporic cultural producers' aesthetic strategies, media forms, and political commitments that makes intelligible the varied and diffuse embodiments and affects that fashion generates as part of visualizing diasporic belonging.
So next we have Meera Sethi, who's amazing work you just saw. She's a Canadian visual artist whose interdisciplinary practice encompasses a range of mediums to pose questions about the relationship between migration, diaspora, identity, and hybridity, often invoking humor and irony. Sethi's work foregrounds histories on the edges of representation, especially queer, diasporic, and post-colonial moments in a contemporary context. Fashion and the politics of dress is an ongoing area of interest. Recent work includes Upping the Aunty, a multidimensional work comprised of street fashion photography, a coloring book for adults, I want that, and a series of paintings that place the figure of the auntie at the center of fashionability. In #Unstitched, an ongoing multi-year project, Sethi investigates the possibilities and tensions of creating community using a single garment, a sari, across multiple diasporic sites. Sethi is the recipient of multiple grants from the Toronto, Ontario, and Canada Arts Councils. Her work has been exhibited internationally and has been featured in NBC, NPR, the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, Fader, Vice, Vogue India, CNN, MTV, and other publications. Please join me in welcoming her.
First of all, going after what Vanita had to say about my work is, it's just, my mind's just going. It was a really interesting sort of ideas that, it was a reading, and it was really interesting reading, and what I want to offer today is not a reading of my work, because it's my own work, but some of the questions that I ask through my work and some of the sort of personal stories that attach to my work. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's really, really great to see a room full of people of color, people interested in fashion and politics and art, especially as other people have mentioned at this moment. It's really, really a wonderful space to be. what I'm going to do first is just sort of lay out some of the context of my wider work and to give you an idea of some of the themes that I work within, and then I'm going to speak specifically about the Upping the Aunty series. So I situate my work sort of an ex-academic, and so some of the thinking around my work comes from thinking about a transnational feminism, or how we can create community across borders that is politically tight. So my artwork focuses on the themes of diaspora, migration, and belonging in relation to ideas of fashion, politics, dress, and adornment. Specifically, I'm quite interested in how diaspora, the experiences of diaspora and migration impact the way we dress, the way we present ourselves, and so I sort of take that as a starting place, as a place of imagination in my artwork, and create sort of from that place. My work and my interest in fashion and adornment sort of stems from a personal history of being someone sort of as a child, as a teenager, being really, really interested in clothing and fashion, going through like a range of different styles, and struggling with that in school, struggling with that in Canada, struggling with that in my experience of traveling back and forth from India to Canada. So really, in a way, the personal element of it is responding to the violences that I experienced growing up, the racism, the heteronormativity, the classism, and so I'm really sort of responding to that on a personal level as well. I'm also really drawn to color and pattern, and I think that experience of traveling or of going to India. I would go to India every 1 or 2 years for about a 3-month period, spend the summer with my grandparents, have a very different wardrobe down there, and then come back to live my life in Canada, and be met in September's when I would come back for school with very cold climate, with a color system that was very different. It was a lot of muted tones, a lot of neutrals, a lot of blacks and grays. And so my work sort of responds to that. In a way, it responds to the idea of chromophobia, which is a fear of color. And so you'll see in a lot of the series that there's a layering of pattern and color, and so much of it. My practice is largely painting, but some of my upcoming work is, and you'll see in this series as well, I'm taking fiber elements and bringing them into my work. There's also some projects that are more social practice oriented. And I've always been keen to shift the object of focus from the center to the margins, or rather bring the margins into the center, to sort of tell these parallel stories of queer, of diasporic, people of color, and our expressions through fashion and clothing. I also see sartorial expression and an engagement with fashion as an example of an ongoing understanding of ourselves. So it's an area in which we have agency. It's an area in which we're sort of continually struggling or continually struggling to express ourselves and our identities as they shift and change. So I don't engage at this point directly with questions of labor or the production of clothing, but I do see clothing as a site of struggle and a site of survival. So, for example, and clothing is very symbolic, right? So, for example, I was thinking about, what to bring with me to New York, what to wear, and I have this favorite white khadi, which is like a hand-spun cotton jacket. It's a vest. It's got no sleeves, so it's just a short vest, and it's got this narrow collar. And I bought this sort of modi in India, and I really like it. Aesthetically, I really like it, and I just thought, what? I don't think I can actually wear that right now because Hindus for Trump and all of the Hindu nationalism that's been happening. for me, that jacket, for me, it relates to like a queer or an Indian feminist lesbian identity, but it's not necessarily seen like that. So, I'm thinking about clothing and items of clothing. They have histories and they have sort of lives beyond what we put on. So let's move to the work. I'm going to run through the photographs, just a handful of photographs first, and then when we get to the paintings, I'm going to go through what the project's about. So Vanita showed you some of the photographs, and here are some of the other street-style photos that I took. And these all were the source material for the paintings. The photos were taken largely in Mumbai, in India, and in Toronto, but I did have a call for submissions, so people did also submit their own images to the project of their own aunties. So the project has three parts. The first part was the documenting street style, taking the photos, and those were, like I said, the source material for the photographs, for the paintings, and also source material for the second part of the project, which was a coloring book. And the reason I did the coloring book, it's a coloring book for adults, and the reason I did the coloring book is because I really wanted people to sort of engage in the process of imagining their aunties, of engage in the process of sort of co-creating auntie fashion, because it's something we're not thinking about as fashion, and I wanted people to have an opportunity to really, color in those skin tones, color in those patterns, those colors, those sneakers with a sari, etc. And so it's got humorous elements to it. That was the second part of the project. The third part of the project were these paintings, and there are a series of 8 paintings. They're quite large. They're life-size, so sort of my height all the way down to the ground, about approximately 6 feet. And the paintings extend the photographs. So there's sort of this imaginative space of upping the photographs, of sort of taking them up to the next level, but very much inspired by the styles that I saw. So it's a project of documenting on the one hand, but also imagining on the other hand. And it's offered to unsettle our understanding of fashion and fashionability. And this is a term I got from Vanita's book, although I think I'm defining it differently. I'm thinking about fashionability as the ability to be fashionable. And we certainly don't look at middle-aged brown women as even having the possibility of being fashionable. So it's really sort of turning that over and asking why is it this way? And it's also about documenting what one might describe as auntie style. This is sort of a colloquial, piece of conversation that as South Asians, we will often talk about auntie style, but what is it? And how can we celebrate this? How can we even notice it in the first place? And then it's also offering a feminist view of femme identity among older South Asian women, recognizing their labor in building communities, particularly in the diaspora, and celebrating them in opposition to the derision that they often that figure often experiences, as Vanita was saying, oh, you're such an auntie is an insult, right? So just trying to turn that around. So some of the questions that I ask, I should move forward. I do want to point out with the work that each of the paintings, so they're quite large, there's quite a bit of detail on them, it's hard to see that on these slides, but each of the paintings has a moment of an area of fabric or other kind of embellishment sort of added onto the canvas to sort of I guess, give them a bit of a three-dimensionality. And so in the one on the left, you can see the metallic ribbon around her necklace. The one on the right, you can, it's hard to tell on the slide, but above, on the base of her salwar, the border is actual fabric on the canvas. So some of the questions I'm asking is, how can we understand anti-style as a style? It's you know, as non-assimilation, as an act of resistance, and sometimes that resistance, you know, I think about it in relation to climate or landscape. So you know, people who've migrated from very different climates and landscapes, how does that shift sort of play itself out in how we dress? You know, so in Canada, it's really interesting sometimes to see, like, you know, really big winter boots, an auntie wearing really big winter boots with her sari. You know, that takes skill. Like, that's not easy. You know, why is that looked down upon? So just these sort of small moments, I wanted to pay attention to in this work. Also, this sense of I don't give a fuckness of anti-style, of not so much in relation to their clothing choices, but in relation to their mainstream notions of beauty and style. So it's like, you know, there's a strength in that, and I really wanted to bring that out in the paintings. So that's speaking back, or can fashion, clothing, can this project, you know, can the way we put ourselves together speak back to big things like patriarchy, nationalism, neoliberalism, exotification, especially in a Western context. And another important element in my work is trying to challenge that boundary between traditional and contemporary. So you'll hear that often, you know, when you're thinking about, when you're, I will hear that question often when, you know, people are talking about clothing, and it's automatically assumed that a sari or a kurta or, you know, any element of clothing that originates in South Asia is traditional, and anything that originates in the West, like sneakers or a ball cap, is contemporary. And so I really want to shift that idea, or just break that binary down, and, you know, and ask, where do these aunties come from? Are they Eastern? Are they Western? You know, why is a sari considered traditional when it, you know, it goes through its own fashion cycles and shifts and changes? Thank you. Also, who has the power to define fashionable? And also, it's important to me to think about fashion intergenerationally. So, you know, who do we find? How do we find style icons who are feminist, who are queer, who are intergenerational, who are people of color, who are personally significant? And, you know, in doing that, what can we offer ourselves? What can we offer our communities? Is that an act of self-care? And on that note, I'm going to close with a passage that I'm going to read you from an artist she's a writer and a photographer from Toronto who now lives in New Delhi, and her name is Anchal Malhotra. She's got this amazing Instagram feed in which she just writes long passages. So this particular passage I'm going to read you is where she's talking about her grandmother's sari, and this sort of it's quite a lovely passage. So she says, in the 1950s, my dadi was employed by the Ministry of Rehabilitation in Delhi, Dadi's grandmother, paternal grandmother, where much of her work comprised of sending abducted women back to their home across the border. There are so many stories I've heard about her work, but most of them, surprisingly, almost amusingly, are about her impeccable wardrobe. There is a photograph of women sitting in an angan, ladies of the office, drinking chai. On the very left is my grandmother wearing a deep sky blue silk sari, her head up in a neat bun. Always a sari to work, so fashionable. Despite waking up at 4 a.m. doing her stitching, waking the children, making their tiffins and sending them to school, waking her husband, making his lunch, and then dressing and leaving for work, she was always, and I mean always, in a crisp sari, ironed and pleated neatly. Can the clothes make the grace of a woman? I have wondered often, can a sari demand elegance of you, especially one with such a rich history? In 2006, I had the chance to wear the blue sari before it was all but tethered due to age. Even though I was just 16, I knew that it was special. I had assigned myself to history. Images of her elegance, femininity, and poise within the small, dusty frame brought out from within me a grace I did not know I possessed. Recently, I found a similar sari, the sublime sky blue silk with a bagru pattern, and it felt like serendipity, as though the sari found me, as though several online searches and dreams of a forgotten fabric had driven the sari to me, and proudly I adorn it.
So next we have Ayqa Khan, who is a self-taught, multidisciplinary visual artist. Khan's practice challenges the way we view femininity and hybrid identities in relation to Orientalism and otherness. Through patterns, color, and brown bodies, she creates a dialogue that examines and questions an ongoing struggle of what it means to exist in a constant state of rejection and exile. Khan has shown across numerous spaces, including New York, Spain, India, and London. Recent exhibitions include Welcome to What We Took From Is the State at Queen's Museum and Submerging at Cooper Union. She has engaged in talks centered around diasporic identity and activism, art at Columbia University, Wellesley College, and Yale University, and her practice is based in New York. Join me in welcoming her.
Hi everyone. I'm pretty nervous. I'm really bad at public speaking, so please bear with me. So I'm not going to be speaking about specific pieces of my work because my work is pretty reflective of my experiences. I'm more interested in speaking about my relationship with body hair and beauty standards. But if anybody has any specific questions about any pieces that they see on the slideshow, please feel free to ask me after the presentation. Okay. So I grew up in Queens, New York until I was about 13 years old. Yeah, who's from Queens here? Anybody? Hey, I'm from Jamaica. I grew up in Jamaica. So I lived in Queens until I was 13 years old, and living in Queens is phenomenal. It was a really amazing experience because there's a very large South Asian diasporic community, and it was a space where I never questioned my identity. It's a space where I never critiqued beauty practices. And my mother is actually the owner of 2 beauty salons, and she's really late, but she'll be here soon. So very classic. So she opened up a beauty salon in the basement of our home when we were living in Queens, and it was a 3-family home. Everybody was South Asian, and I was exposed to these sort of beauty rituals every single day, and this sort of beauty ritual was something that I normalized. It was something that I viewed as a space of solidarity and a space of community that my mother was able to create for the other South Asian women in the neighborhood. So I never thought negatively of body hair removal, and I also didn't really think negatively of, I guess, grooming upkeep. And I was also really young. I didn't hit puberty at the time, and a few years later, my mom opened up a beauty salon in Long Island. So she moved out of the basement. She opened up a store in Long Island, and we moved with her. Like we got a house in Long Island, and I was around 14, 15. So within my first year and a half in Long Island, also don't raise your kids in Long Island. It's a very terrible place to raise your kids. If you are a person of color and you bring your child and your family into a predominantly white neighborhood, your child will more than likely have a very deep identity complex. Okay. So anyways, we moved to Long Island, and within the first year and a half of me starting school, I had no friends. And I know I did not have friends because of the color of my skin, because of the way that I looked, and because of the way that I dressed. So during this year and a half, I became a sociologist. So I studied the way that everybody dressed. I studied the way that they spoke. I studied the brands that they wore. And I studied the grooming, the way that they kept up with their physical appearance, both girls and boys, but it was only girls that were keeping up with, I guess, beauty standards. So I started to engage in removing my body hair. I tried skin bleaching once, and also I was really lucky because my mom has a beauty salon. I was very easy to access these resources. So getting wax was really, really simple. And this stuff is very, very expensive. So I remember I tried skin bleaching. Oh, that's my mom. So I tried skin bleaching once, and I remembered smelling the bleach, and it was so strong. I knew that I could not try this. So, I mean, I went on and did like lemon and yogurt masks, and I did more homemade remedies. So I started practicing these rituals, and I started developing this sort of beauty care and this beauty routine that was solely based on performing this identity to be accepted by this community that I was around. And I'm somebody who's very lazy, so it was very hard for me to keep up with these beauty rituals as high school progressed. And towards the end of high school, I didn't really continue practicing these beauty rituals. So a few years later, I started college at FIT, which was the fall of 2013. So I went in for a major in business, and within my first semester, I was put on academic probation. I was failing because I was very miserable studying business, but I also was very lost. I had no interests. I had no sense of community. So I was spending a lot of time on Tumblr. And also throughout this time, I was creating artwork. I was doing digital drawings. I was working on paintings. I was taking photos. And like the reason I'm not interested in speaking specifically about specific pieces is because I feel like a lot of my work just very much so mirrors my experiences. So I was spending a lot of time on Tumblr, and I came across South Asian artists. And coming across South Asian artists was like a mindfuck. I had no idea that I was never exposed to South Asian artists, but I was also introduced to POC communities, queer POC communities, Muslim queer POC communities, and being engaged with this community was very exciting because these are spaces that I saw myself interacting in and being in, but these were spaces that were not accessible to me. So spending a lot of time on Tumblr, and I also came across internet artists. So internet artists are artists who use virtual platforms as their gallery, so it's interactive. If you have Instagram or if you have Tumblr and you're promoting your work and you're an internet artist, you're interacting with your viewers, you're responding to comments, or you're only posting your work. But I'm somebody who enjoys engaging with my audience. I like responding to questions. I like responding to messages because I feel like, in some of my work and in some pieces, especially some pieces with body hair, like when it comes to identity and when it comes to accepting yourself, for me, it's never been a solo experience. It's been entirely an interactive experience between other people and myself. So having people support my work and having people engage with it has allowed me to accept, I guess, parts of myself and also question parts of myself. So I started using Tumblr as a platform, and I guess within a few months I started getting some pretty good feedback. My work was circulating pretty widely within within like 6 months of me starting to post my work, and with circulation I started getting opportunities to show work in physical spaces, to, I guess, the superficial stuff like interviews and press started happening. But I think the best thing that has come out of me showcasing my work online has me being able to enter these physical spaces that I've wanted to be in for so long. So a space like this today where it's predominantly POC and we're having discussions like this, but also finding queer POC, finding queer Muslims, and it's not really easy to find these sort of communities. And I think one of the reasons why I really appreciate, and I mean, social media and virtual platforms have their pros and cons, but one of the things that I really love and admire about these platforms is that there's no other place where you are exposed to such a versatile spectrum of identities. And this is something that I really appreciate about virtual platforms. What else is there to say? Yeah, so something that I do question being an internet artist is I question how sustainable it is to constantly be promoting my work, and I also question what it means to project certain identities on virtual platforms, have them be quote unquote validated and supported, you know, on these virtual spaces, but when you step off of these spaces and you enter real physical spaces, it's completely different. I don't know many women who grow out their body hair, but there are many people in queer communities that have body hair. Whenever I post images of body hair, I do read the comments that I get, and most of them are very supportive, and most of them are, I guess, empowering and validating, and many times people respond very uncomfortably, and the uncomfortable responses are very expected because body hair has not been normalized in any sort of mainstream space ever. You don't see people on TV with body hair, you don't see people on magazine covers, it's nothing, you don't see it anywhere. And whenever you do see it, it's tokenized. It's like, look at these people projecting body hair, wow, so radical. And I don't know, it makes me question, I guess, how I view body hair sometimes and the relationship that I have. And the relationship that I have with body hair is very, very, it's very relaxed. It's not something that I'm trying to rub in everyone's faces. It's like, this is something that grows with my mind. This is something that grows with my age. It's something that I'm not trying to push onto you, and it's also something that, like, I'm not trying to say removing your body hair is entirely bad. I mean, beauty rituals they've been around for so long, and it's not easy to really break these things. But I guess talking about future projects and things that I plan on working on, my friend Ayqa, who's here, we are putting together a children's book on body hair. So if anybody knows of any grants or any funding, please find me after this event. I'm not sure if I'm too interested in continuing using virtual platforms as, I guess, a gallery space, because I don't know how sustainable this is. I'm having opportunities to come into physical spaces, but I don't know, they're just so temporary, they're so fleeting, they're not tangible, and I think I'm looking for something that is very tangible. So I'm looking to go back to school, I'm looking to apply for grants, I'm looking to try different mediums, and I don't know, when I started doing this, when I started posting work online, I did not know what I was getting myself into. There's no sense of structure with the internet, and that's how it is now. I kind of take everything day by day, I take opportunities day by day, and I'm kind of just seeing where things go, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Ayqa. So now Professor Thuy Linh too is going to come up and give us a short response on what we've heard. She's the director of the American Studies program and assistant professor in the NYU Department of Social and Cultural Analysis. I don't think you're assistant, no. Associate. Her research interests include Asian American studies, popular visual studies, and immigration and labor studies. She's the author of The Beautiful Generation, Asian Americans and the Cultural Economy of Fashion, and co-editor of Alien Encounters, Popular Culture in Asian America, and Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life. Join me in welcoming.
Thanks so much, Sharon, and thanks so much to all our presenters today. I'll just echo what Sharon was saying earlier. I mean, I think a lot of us were struggling to find enthusiasm to come tonight, after the events on Tuesday. And and I think for me in particular, I started having, well, first of all, a lot of paranoid thoughts about like paranoid things happening, right? But then also a feeling that I don't come here and talk about beauty and fashion when there are all these like really important, stuff going on and things we should be talking about. But I went back to look at Vanita's book, which we're here to celebrate. So let's just take a moment to cheer for Vanita's new book. And also just listening to all our presenters today, that I'm actually reminded of something that I actually really believe, that beauty and fashion are not actually ancillary to any of this, but it's actually quite central to a lot of the things we're talking about right now. And it's Vanita's work and all these presenters really remind me that, what we, part of what people experience when they're experiencing, or how people experience these kind of moments of radical ruptures and upheaval, whether it's migration or anything else, right, is actually through these quite intimate and embodied ways, right? Through the ways that they're thinking about and aspiring to forms of beauty and fashion. And Meera, your offside comment about climate, right? It just struck me as, it rung so true to me, because I think, whether it's like the Indian auntie or the Vietnamese woman who's like wearing her áo dài in the middle of winter, freezing her butt off, right? That's partly how she is experiencing the practice of migration. And I remember reading once this poem, and I can't quite remember the author or the name of the poem, so maybe I made it up, but about a refugee girl from Vietnam, a girl who was a refugee from the Vietnam War, much like myself, and it was either called Suitcases or Shoes or something like that, right? And, it's this short poem where she's gazing at these sneakers, and, all the kids are wearing the sneakers, and she tries on the sneakers, and they signal for her this moment of arrival, right, after the war, and they make something that's so profoundly foreign to her quite intimate and in many ways really manageable. And I remember feeling the same when I put on my first pair of sneakers, right, which we did not have in Vietnam, right? And I felt so sporty and so American. And trust me when I tell you that I've never heard a Vietnamese person describe themselves as sporty. And here I was feeling so sporty, right? And that expression, walking in someone's shoes, right? It's supposed to suggest that we understand their perspective in some way, right? But actually, it's much more fundamentally about embodying a position, right? Because when you put on a different pair of shoes, or when you wear a different dress, right, you walk differently, you hold your body differently, your shoulders slump differently or hold up high differently, you swagger or you don't swagger. It's in other words, like these various forms of sartorial and beauty changes are really how we experience the everyday, right, of migration, and it's not disconnected from these kind of structural understandings of migration at all, right? And it's certainly not disconnected in this moment, but in particular, when I went back to Vanita's book, she's talking about this feeling of beauty, right? That, South Asian artists and people think about and aspire to, and she's asking, what are beauty's socially animating capacities? Right, I think, and I don't want to interpret for her, she's right there, you can ask her, right? She's asking, what can beauty do or not for us? What can thinking about it and aspiring to it? And in this presentation, she's talking about this idea of social vanity, right? What can social vanity do for us, right? For this group, And fundamental or implicit in that question is like she's asking who gets to have social vanity and who has to actually aspire to have it. And it's your question too, Meera, about fashionability, right? Why don't the aunties get to claim fashionability? And why is it so dissonant to see these bodies in these kinds of spaces dressed in this way? So, in other words, what I think we're hearing here today is that fashion and style is one of the primary ways that bodies can be read, right? And bodies can be presented either as foreign or different, right? And certainly in the case of the aunties, right? In the ways that they appear so dissonant, or even the chic Sikhs, right? That somehow look like they belong in that environment, right? But yet also feel so dissonant from it, right? And also how fashion and beauty can actually tie us together. And Meera, you didn't talk very much about the Unstitched project, but that's one of the sites where I think, you can imagine how fashion and beauty actually bring us together in a community, right? And I guess what I'm trying to say is like, this of course is what we're struggling to think about right now, right? How do we understand difference and commonality? How do we understand us and them, and how do we negotiate those divides? And, just yesterday I was asking my students, if they thought, or how they thought about the relationship between aesthetic value and social value, right? Is there a relationship What is that relationship? You know, between people and things we think of as beautiful and people and things we think of as ugly, right? What does it mean to be considered ugly or beautiful? And what kinds of bodies do we see when we think of these categories? And so what I was suggesting to them when I was asking this question is that, you know, every aesthetic judgment we make is also a social judgment, and vice versa, right? And I suggested, in short, that the contest over what is beautiful is, in this sense, a contest over what's valuable. In other words, a contest over power, right? And I think, you know, Ayqa, you put this so beautifully when you talk about the space of the, you know, you tell your story about the space of the salon that you belong to, and then sort of emerging into Long Island, which is, well, Long Island, right? And what that moment did for you and your sense of yourself, you know, and I think also about, you know, the history of civil rights and how we can think about this history of civil rights, for instance, without also the history of the Black is Beautiful movement, right? It just doesn't make sense to think of them as separate from each other, right? And so, you know, I'll conclude by just saying that, you know, the panelists and Vanita's work in particular has really helped me to articulate a relationship between beauty and power. And I think any analysis of power right now is not at all ancillary to what we should be talking about. And I don't really have any sage words or sort of like beautiful ways to wrap up all that's been said, only just really deep gratitude for their work. Because I think in many ways this kind of transnational feminist aesthetic practice and criticism is really the kind of voice we need.
Thanks, Thuy. Now, if the panelists will join me up here, we'll just do a short discussion and Q&A.
I was just really wondering, Meera, what is the response of aunties to Upping the Aunty?
Yeah, it was beautiful because, you know, I had the paintings launch at a solo exhibition in Toronto at this place called Daniel Spectrum, which is at a gallery within this community hub called Daniel Spectrum that's in an area that is largely people of color, a lot of South Asians as well. And the opening was a real mix of generations, so, you know, youth, friends and family that I know, and some aunties. So some people brought their mothers, and then over the course of the couple months, several aunties sort of came by. And, you know, one auntie that night actually had tears in her eyes at the end, and she's like that, I see myself up there, you know, and that moment was so special to me because it was like, that's why I'm doing this, you know. I didn't get that, and you know, I want to make sure that this is, I was just really happy that it sort of struck those emotional chords for people, and especially for aunties, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Thuy mentioned, you know, the Vietnamese auntie, and, you know, in Korean culture we have the ajumma figure, you know, the woman with the ginormous visor. You all know her. You know, and she's wearing gloves for no reason other than to cover up from the sun. And so, you know, when I'm listening to you speak, I'm seeing all of those versions, right, that we can all relate to. And so in that way, I think those representations are not just about the aunties, but about, right, you know, the auntie inside of all of us, right, and validating that for us. So that's really special.
I do want to add one funny thing. When I was painting these, I paint these in my parents' basement. That's where my studio is at the moment for the bigger work. And my mom came down a few times, and I was painting one particular auntie, the one with the iPad, and she's sort of very Punjabi looking. And she, you know, she comes up to it and she's like, doesn't I stand like that? and then she commented about that. I stand like that with the iPad, and doesn't that look like the pattern on my, you know, on my kurta? And so it's just really, really cute. Yeah.
Is there also a comment on like aging versus the young ideal? I guess in both of your work.
Definitely. I mean, I think age really factors into fashion. We don't think of older people. I mean, it's so prescribed what is considered fashionable, you know, a certain body size, a certain style, a certain age. Like there's all these factors, and age is a big one. So yeah, this is definitely part of the work for me.
I don't understand what you're asking.
Like kind of, I guess the idea of like youth and idealism, and then aging, kind of losing that. So I feel like it's almost a subversion of that idea.
I feel like you don't really see age with my work, because I'm not really drawing particular faces, and I'm not really drawing, I guess, certain body shapes, but also, I mean, specifically, I guess, photo work. My photo work is so different from illustrations, and the work that I do with pastels is also completely different. So I guess maybe specifically I'll speak for the digital illustrations, where I'm drawing mainly figures with body hair. I think there is a sense of age with those images, especially because I'm reflecting on myself, and I'm reflecting around also on like the community that I surround myself with, which usually is maybe like, I guess, under 25. And I also feel like I don't know how a lot of older women, I don't remember how a lot of older women respond to my work, or if they necessarily see themselves in my work, because your work is also very whimsical and like very colorful, but the figures are so specific and they're so clear. Like you very much still see an auntie. And I think with some of mine, like the figures are pretty loose or pretty abstract, so you can't even tell sometimes what the gender is, and that is my intention. I'm not interested in specifying gender. I'm not interested in specifying feminine or masculinity. So I don't know, maybe like kind of in between.
Thanks. It was such a wonderful panel, and it was really heartening to hear all of you speak today. I had a question. I think it's mostly for Meera and Vanita, but I was thinking about the tension, and I think this isn't actually a challenge. It's something that I struggle with too in thinking about transnational feminism. But the tension between, I love Upping the Aunty, and I've seen the work before, but the tension between the unsuitable girls, that was the title, and then the Upping the Aunty, because I think many of us who are South Asian know like that kind of circuit of care, whether or not they're actually like blood kin that like other older women like provide, but there's also a fair amount of disciplinary, right? Like kind of so it's like don't go. The aunties that are like you're getting too dark, or you're like don't go in the sun, or don't sit like that, or or too much body hair, and then the unsuitable girl like kind of speaks back to this sort of heteropatriarchal norms, even while I do completely understand that sort of, like the kinds of relations of care, Meera, that you're like kind of evoking. I'm just wondering if you wanted to say something about that particular tension, which I think is a challenge for transnational feminism generally as a practice, right? Like aesthetic and critical practice.
My first thought is that actually I think the tension is both the one you're drawing, but also within the figure of the auntie itself, right? Because, and I think this might have been very quick and dirty in the way that I laid it out, but the auntie is also, I think, a constitutively contradictory figure, because she can be both a disciplinarian, but she is also often the figure that is that offers reprieve from those modes of discipline, right? So like she's the auntie that you come out to, or that the auntie is someone you come out to, or that you take solace in when you actually feel the force, right, of disciplinary measures, right? So I think I said both of those things, that she can enforce those kinds of communal norms, but she can also be the one to offer some respite from that, or reprieve from that. And I think often the same auntie does both. Like, I think we've all experienced, right, like both of those things from the same person. So I think that, I know it doesn't really answer your question, but I think it just complicates it a little bit more. And I think that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about the figure of the auntie, is that she can, and I think the fashion part sort of suggests both of those things, right? That she's both, but I think in your series, sort of pushing against those, heteropatriarchal expectations in her own embodiment. Even though she could be read as also fulfilling them in other ways, like I think there is that, the way that she's pushing against them too, if only in insisting on fashionability through the aging body. So that's just my initial thought.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and important question, and one that's probably, on everyone's mind when they think about aunties, that, you know, the auntie is this figure of like, you know, beta, don't do that, you know, you've got too much gray on your head, you know, you really need to dye your hair, or whatever those, you know, that side of the auntie figure. But, and, you know, I don't deny any of that, and that's very much there in popular culture, of the figure of the auntie really embodies these disciplinarian kind of tactics and acts. My project was different though, and, you know, and it really wasn't about that. So it's not that that doesn't exist. It really wasn't about that. It was much more about gender and aging and migration and fashion, or being outside of sort of what is considered fashionable. And I think the starting place one of the starting places for the series was, you know, looking at a lot of the fashion blogs out there. There are so many fashion blogs, and at the time I was looking at a lot of them, and it really dawned on me of like, the only time I might see an auntie on one of these blogs is if she's like, you know, really capturing someone's imagination of exotic, you know, what's an exotic look, right? You're not going to see an everyday auntie on these fashion blogs simply because she's not considered attractive or beautiful or fashionable or interesting, and I just wanted to respond to that with the series.
Yeah, just continuing with what Meera was saying, I think it's so interesting what your entire process was with the Upping the Aunty series. And did you have any idea, did you have an idea initially when you started that you were going to do this in 3 parts, or was it that you just started going out on the street and photographing these aunties? So that's one part of the question, but really what I wanted to say is, from a fashion perspective, it's like, you know, I didn't really grow up with aunties, and of course it's like I know who they are, what they represent, etc. But you sort of, you presented them in a way like almost like a fashion subculture. And I think that's so interesting. And that's, when I look at the work, that's what I'm thinking. I mean, the fashion element is undeniable. I mean, the mix of patterns and the boldness. I mean, the sartorial choices are really specific to aunties, and on one hand, I just think it's like super cool. I mean, it's like a fashion subculture of aunties. And I also thought what could be interesting, if you're going to do something, a 3rd part, while you were talking, you said anti-fashion, and I like that as well, but I like anti-fashion, right? So what was your process? I mean, when you started, did you have that in mind, that you were going to do this in 3 parts, or did it just develop?
I applied for a grant for this project, and so I knew that street photography was going to inform paintings. The coloring book came in because I've just wanted to do one for a long time, and I was like, you know what, I think everybody wants to color in sneakers with a sari. Like, everybody needs to color in sneakers with a salwar, you know, it's just...
When you did the coloring book, what's really funny, because I actually got one of the coloring books, if you remember, like 3 years ago. What's really cool is around that time I was Christmas shopping, and in all the bookstores, it was all coloring books, and so it's like you really tapped into something there, and there was sort of a resurgence of that. So the entire work was interesting on every level, and every part of it touched on what was happening kind of culturally, whether that was your intention or not.
Thank you. I just want to jump off from what Richard asked to ask all of you this, and I'm thinking about, you know, I'm trying to understand, Vinita, you talked about, I think, with Sikh chic, and a few of you talked about, and I'm interested in your work around exotification of the radical, but when we are appropriation, right, because you were talking about appropriation with the Sikh chic thing, can aunties, for example, you know, is auntie style sort of at the margins where it can't actually, it's not going to be appropriated, we're not going to see them on the runway, or is it a subculture that is eventually going to be appropriated, and, you know, people are going to be like, oh, that's really cool, not just people who are thinking about it politically?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, when you were saying your commentary, I was thinking like, okay, well, I wonder how aunties would respond to them actually understanding that we view this as a subculture. Like, and I guess the question I wanted to ask you was, besides these responses of emotional attachment or like feeling some sort of emotion with your work, like, has anyone really, I guess, comprehended that this could be some sort of subculture viewed from a different lens? But we can talk about that after. I'm sorry, I forgot what you were asking. I lost track.
Just around is auntie style, like the limits of appropriation, like do you see it being appropriated in mainstream fashion, or is it just, yeah, I mean, are there limits to appropriation? Is everything just eventually going to be appropriated and exotified in the culture that we exist in?
I think, like, specifically with the auntie fashion, like, personally being someone who's South Asian and second generation and just being really fascinated by fashion and textiles, but more specifically South Asian textiles, like, I love this hybrid identity, and that's how I often present myself. I'm interested in Western meets Pakistan. I really like that look, and that's something that I carry naturally, and I've also noticed that people find a fascination with it more than it being normal, more than it being normalized. But I do think what I can say, and this is something that I've been thinking about, and I actually, like, prior to this talk, I've been doing some research on social media. So I've been doing research on Tumblr and Instagram, and I've been finding photos of second generation Americans who are South Asian presenting themselves in this hybrid identity and kind of questioning whether or not this is a performance and, like, what does it mean to be an authentic South Asian also. So I started finding these images of South Asian men, women, gender non-conforming people, you know, choosing jewelry and then wearing like a blouse, like a button-up blouse, and all these different styles. And I found it really interesting because the look is so individual and is so authentic in itself, but because it's, I guess, having all those images, and also all of these images are in a very short time frame. So I'm like, okay, is this a new trend that's happening? Like, all of a sudden I see all these South Asians try to produce this sort of hybrid identity on social media. So I don't know, I think it could potentially happen. Also, like, with the Shisha's collection, the recent one, like the whole immigrant line, like, that was inspired by the Hindu gods and goddesses. So I guess that didn't really have, some of the apparel was very Western influence. It was like West plus also the South Asian textiles. So I definitely could see it happening.
I just have one really quick thought with that, which is I could see part of what my reading, as you said, of your series is that it, you know, in relation to other kinds of, like in relation to more mainstream street style, like I wouldn't call it mainstream, but with Sing Street style, right, he's sort of mimicking, like he wants Sikh men to reproduce this particular look, like that is, and I think what your photographs at least show is that there is something that can't be rehabilitated for imitation, right? Like there is something so individual about the auntie that, so I think my answer with regard to your photographs is no, right? Like they do exist kind of on this, intentionally so, but it doesn't exclude them from fashionability, which I think is what's interesting about the series. But I could imagine something like chappals and socks or saris with sneakers or so. Like I could see that, like I could see particular signatures becoming auntie style. And there is, I think you might have mentioned this on your website, this thing in India with logo saris, right? And some of you might know better than I, but my understanding of this is that it's mostly aunties who are wearing them. It's not like young women who are wearing logo saris, like, you know, the Apple logo, you'll see. So that's an interesting way to think about it too, because that's using the figure of the auntie to actually do a particular kind of like work. And so that's maybe a different understanding of fashion. Maybe it doesn't make the auntie fashionable, but it makes the auntie a figure that can mobilize a particular kind of, you know, aesthetic or something.
Yeah, I'll just add, I agree with Vanita. I think it would be hard to appropriate your photographs in the way that you're, right? But fashion has no capacity. There's no outside to it, right? There's no end to it. There's no outer limit to it, right? Just a couple of years ago, Yves Saint Laurent was sending around all of this like burqa fashion down the runway at the very same time that in Paris they were like ripping headscarves off people. And there was no sense of irony, there was no sense of dissonance at all. There's no outside to it, right? And the funny thing is, when I saw your images, you know, the socks and sandals, they've become such a big thing in fashion right now, socks and sandals. And it you know, it lingered in my like historical or unconscious somewhere. I've seen this before. Where have I seen this? And I look at your photograph and I think, oh, this is where I have seen it. These aunties and that auntie, right? So I think I appreciate this comment about, you know, sort of producing a kind of a fashionability for a certain kind of subculture, but there's always a kind of relationship between the subculture and so-called mainstream, right? And there's always sort of movements between them. You know, how we think about those movements or how we structure those movements, I think, is really the question.
I keep thinking about something you said, which is that I don't give a fuckness, right? That's how you describe the aunties. And in thinking about the first question about the comparison between the sort of youthful body and the aging body, that was a sort of through line that I saw in both of your work, right? Is this idea of I don't give a fuckness. And in that sense, I think the auntie style, right, can be appropriated as a kind of style, but that's also where that tension that Crystal was bringing up is, right? She's the person who wants you to study hard and, in Korean culture would be, you know, the auntie that wants you to get plastic surgery, right? And yet she doesn't care and doesn't give a fuck and is wearing socks with sandals. So it's like, how do we make sense of that, right? And it's interesting to see the performative gestures. It's quite different when youthful bodies perform that I don't give a fuckness versus the aging body. And to see that side by side in your work was, I think, really interesting.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciated the presentations, but I just wanted to kind of insert a little bit of, it's not clear to me whether, like how auntie is being defined here. Because at one level it's like, you know, your mother's friends, one's mother's friends, someone, or like, you know, women starting, I don't know, from like well, it depends, right? When you're young, women of the 30s may have been your aunties, right? So it's not clear to me like the kind of, like what actually constitutes an auntie, because I can think of plenty of women who don't necessarily dress like that, who we're all calling aunties, right? So I'm wondering, in terms of the kind of self-conscious, there's a way that these wonderful photographs and wonderful paintings, there's a sense, I feel like within them, they invite a reading of like a fashion subculture or a kind of self-consciousness about how one is projecting oneself, which is, I'm not quite sure if that type of intentionality is necessarily there on the women themselves. And then also I just wanted to inject the fact that issues of regional difference, class, caste, religion, you know, like I'm a little worried that we have this category auntie, but women of a certain generation may not be seeing themselves as like similar to one another. I mean, unfortunately, in the kind of South Asian context. So I'm a little troubled by the kind of simple use of auntie, I guess I wanted to, because I could think of a whole number of women looking of, a certain age group, looking at those photos and saying like, oh, that's what those people dress like. We don't dress like this. Well, however, so I just kind of wanted to just throw that in there. In terms of this, how does one think about issues of diversity within the South Asian community? And also just to kind of tag back onto Crystal's point, I think not so much, not just in the realm of, say, bleach your mustache or whatever, shave your legs, but actually a certain generation of South Asian women have also been tremendous cultural gatekeepers, right? So it's like, don't marry that person, you should, so I don't want to be a killjoy, but I just wanted to kind of insert those questions of power and difference kind of back into this discussion. I mean, I think all those questions are necessary, and part of it points to the challenge of defining or labeling or naming. How do we speak about, or how, as an artist or someone interested in fashion and clothing and migration and difference, how do I kind of define this repeated pattern that I'm seeing without also, you know, excluding, like in defining you are excluding, right? But I think questions of caste and class and religion, you know, etc., and gender also, right? Not all aunties are femme. All the aunties in my project, in my paintings, are femme, but you know that's not always the case. So it's not. I'm certainly not creating something where I'm like, well, this is what defines an auntie. You know, I'm just kind of coming from my one individual place as an artist and saying this is interesting to me and I'm curious about this. Not that this is all that exists, and not that these things don't reflect in how we dress or how we view other people who dress that way. And coming back to your earlier sort of comment about how do you define an auntie? I mean, I've been called an auntie several times, and you know, and it's very subjective, right? So it's very subjective, and I don't know. I don't know if it's because, you know, after I reached a certain age, or someone saw gray in my hair, or maybe I was dressed a particular way one day, or maybe that's just what, you know, the kids were like taught that they should say to a woman who's older than them. So yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have any more time, but we are going to continue these discussions here. We're having a reception and a book signing, so please join me in thanking our panelists for their words and their visions. And please stay and reception with us.